Hi, my name is John Brakey. I'm the director of Audit Elections USA. Audit is an acronym which stands for Americans United for Democracy, Integrity, and Transparency in Elections. We are a nonpartisan group of citizens who believe that elections belong to the people, not the political parties or corporations. Our method is education, advocacy, and litigation only if necessary. Together, we will be pioneering a method of public oversight which will prevent election fraud, detect it when it occurs, and ensure the accuracy of vote counts. Our method is to first educate election officials and the public about what is required by existing law, federally and state. And second, to ensure that the laws are followed by turning ballot storage into a ballot library by marrying the physical hand-marked paper ballot to the ballot image and make ballot images a public record. This short film that you are about to see was filmed on Saturday, May 21st, I should say, in North Carolina. The purpose was to bring together key individuals from the right and left in North Carolina. It was pre-agreed that this meeting would be about solutions versus going through the problems, which are very controversial, complicated, and create division among us. In a time of deep political divide in our nation, Audit Elections USA and Ken Bennett are focused on bringing different ideologies together to work towards a goal we can agree on, like elections that are transparent, trackable, publicly verified with a ballot library. We hope that you'll take the time to watch this and realize, as Ken and I have, that the problems are complicated, but the solutions are simple and really don't cost anything because the infrastructure to do this is in place. Our voting system has gone digital, and these voting machines do not count the hand-marked paper ballot. It counts the picture that it took on that hand-marked paper ballot, and that picture is a public record. So please sit back, learn how the right and left are coming together to agree that the black box must be transparent, trackable, and publicly verified. As Americans, we should be able to agree that counting is a public process. Thank you.
Okay, I have started the recording, and I'm sure other people will be joining as we go forward. So good afternoon, good morning to everybody. I know we're going to have people from Arizona on the call. We're going to have people from Tennessee on the call, and obviously North Carolina. I'm Jason Jehorek. I'm with nc-elections.com, and I'm working with Lynn Bernstein and with John Brakey on working together. So we have Democrats and we have Republicans on this call, and we're all here working together on to create fair and honest elections. So I'm going to introduce our main speaker today, which is Ken Bennett from Arizona. And Kenneth Roy Bennett is an American businessman and politician who served as president of the Arizona Senate. Ken served as the 19th Secretary of State of Arizona from 2009 to 2015. He was a candidate for governor of Arizona primary in 2004 to 2018 elections. Ken was the liaison for the Maricopa audit by cyber ninjas and the Arizona Senate state. So Ken, welcome to the team, and I'm going to turn it over to you, sir.
Thanks, Jason. I have had kind of a dual career, as Jason mentioned, business for 35 plus years, but also got into public service, served in the state Senate and as Secretary of State. When I became Secretary of State in 2009, I started hearing about a guy in Tucson who was stirring up the pot in southern Arizona to watch elections and make sure that they were being done in a open and transparent and accurate manner. His name was John Brakey. The staff that I inherited at the Secretary of State's office, they were a little perturbed usually about what John would do. But as I got to know John over the years, I developed a tremendous trust and respect for the fact that all he was trying to do was to make sure that our elections were accurate and fair. And I kept hearing him use three words: transparent, trackable, and publicly verified. And so years later, after I'm no longer Secretary of State, I'm comfortably living up here in northern Arizona when the state Senate of Arizona started fighting with Maricopa County about whether the 2020 election was done correctly or not. And the president of the Arizona Senate currently is the state senator from my district. I've known her most of my adult life. So I called Karen Fan and said, if I can be of any help, I've been in your position, Karen, as a state senator and president of the Senate. I've been the Secretary of State, the chief elections official in the state of Arizona. You're fighting pretty vehemently with the county over how to audit this election or whatever. If I can be of any help. Well, she took me up on my offer and asked me to be the liaison to the audit. Now, I had nothing to do with selecting the auditor. In retrospect, I think it's unfortunate that they picked somebody who had kind of weighed in on the election, and that made it almost impossible for them to have the neutrality and the credibility that an auditor needs to have. And so they got beat up almost from the very beginning. But I actually felt that Doug Logan, the owner of Cyber Ninjas, was an honest man trying to do what he thought was the right thing. But I had nothing to do with selecting his company. I had nothing to do with what they did at the audit on a daily basis. I was just the eyes and ears. And so for a matter of, well, the first thing I did when I became the audit liaison for the Senate is I called the Arizona Democrat Party and asked them to assign someone, a Democrat, a prominent Democrat, to be a co-liaison with me so that we had that bipartisan nature that is critical to elections. In Arizona, as I'm sure in most states, you don't hardly do anything in elections without making sure that the observers and the participants that you allow in an election come from whatever parties they're from, or independents or whatever. And if you have procedures for duplicating ballots, or if you have procedures for checking equipment, or you usually have two people from different parties. So I wanted somebody from the Democrat Party in the state of Arizona to be a co-liaison with me. Unfortunately, they were having none of it. They contacted everybody who I tried to contact, including a former Senate president, Democrat, who I had served with when I was in the legislature, and basically told him, don't help the audit. And so about the fourth or fifth person on my list, after I realized that the state Democrat Party was going to almost prohibit people from cooperating, I called John Brakey. And John, bless his heart, was courageous enough to agree to come be my wingman at the audit. And I drove down from Prescott. He drove up from Tucson for 4.5 months. And we were there almost every day for 4.5 months. We also were able to get the chairman of the Maricopa County Libertarian Party to be a co-liaison with us. And we were there and watched everything that was happening. Now, everything that happened at the audit, there were some good things. First of all, there were a lot of good people. There were a lot of good people, some of whom were absolutely convinced that the election was stolen. Others that were not convinced of that at all. We had Democrat observers, we had Libertarians, we had Republicans. There was a plethora of and a wide range of philosophies and viewpoints of the people that came to watch what was happening in the audit, participate in the teams that were actually counting the ballots. Everybody had background checks and on and on and on. But it didn't take long before John and I realized that there were some serious issues there. I can remember as we got to after about 3 months, I asked the auditor if we knew the preliminary results of the votes counted on the ballots by people versus the votes reported by the county 8 months earlier, counted by the machines. And he said, they knew that, but I was not authorized to know that information. And then I said, well, do we even know did we account for the same number of ballots that Maricopa County said there was? I mean, we received 46 pallets of ballots. Most pallets had 32 to 40 boxes of ballots on each pallet, and each box had somewhere between 12 and 1,400 ballots. Hand counting just 2 races in a jurisdiction the size of Maricopa. I think it's the second largest election jurisdiction in the country. 2.1 million ballots, hand counting that in just 2 races, the president and U.S. Senate, is a massive undertaking. But at certain key points, I was shocked at what I heard from the auditor that when I asked, for example, do we know how many ballots we've even accounted for? And he said, yes. I said, well, does the Senate know that number before we send all these ballots back to the county? Because if it's significantly different than what the county said the Senate ought to know that. Maybe we don't send the ballots back. And he stopped and had to think about whether or not the Senate should know how many ballots they had accounted for. That blew me away. I was stunned that the auditor had to think about whether or not the Senate should be told how many ballots we had accounted for, irrespective of the votes we had counted on those ballots. And so I strongly recommended that the Senate be told how many ballots we had accounted for before we shipped them back. And it was just 2 days later that the Senate announced they were going to have a third count. They were going to have an independent third count just to count the number of ballots, not recount the votes on those ballots, but just count. Now that told me that the number of ballots that the auditors had preliminarily accounted for had to be significantly different than what the county had said they sent over, or we wouldn't have had a third count. But weeks later, after we did have that third count, the final results of the auditor was that they had accounted for within 996 total ballots, just pieces of paper, of what the county had accounted for. The county said there were 2,089,563 ballots, and the auditors felt that they had accounted for 2,088,567. So we were within 996 just numbers of pieces of paper. And that's pretty good. And when they counted the votes for the president race, which was obviously the focus in Arizona because we had the tightest presidential election we ever had. Biden won Arizona by 10,457 votes, and that's 0.3%. And when the auditor announced what they had tabulated with persons counting that race, they announced to the Senate on September 24th that they had come up within 350 votes of the same number that the county had tabulated back in November of 2020. Now, there were lots of other findings or insinuations by the auditors about problems in the election, and no election is perfect. I was the Secretary of State of Arizona for 6 years, and I oversaw 12 statewide elections. There's no one alive in Arizona that has overseen more statewide elections than I have. Probably the one person who did was Rose Mofford, who was the Secretary of State for 26 years, but she passed away 7 or 8 years ago. And she's the only one probably in the history of the state that oversaw more statewide elections than Ken Bennett did. And I oversaw the only statewide recount in the state of Arizona in 2010, when we had to recount almost 2 million ballots, and the second count came up within 12 votes of the first count. So if I went into the audit with a bias, I went in with the bias that machines count pretty accurately, as long as nobody's manipulated the machines. Machines count ballots pretty accurately because I had recounted 2 million ballots and came within 12 votes of the first one. But I got into the audit not to prove that it was stolen or prove that it wasn't stolen. I got involved just because I wanted to get to the truth. And after what happened at the audit really didn't convince people on either side that it left way too many people in Arizona still thinking that we hadn't answered the question of whether the election in Arizona was stolen or not. I began to think with John and others, how do we solve this problem going forward? And that's why we're, I hope, here today. And so as John and I spent the next weeks and even months thinking about, given our daily experience for 4.5 months in the audit, and I'm not going to go into all the stories that we heard from some of the audit workers, some very, very qualified people who were telling us things that would disturb you greatly. For example, after they had counted for 3 or 4 weeks and had to break because of another event that was happening in the Coliseum there, one of the guys told John and I that the count that they had determined at that point, they thought they had counted about 700,000 ballots, and the spreadsheet that they were using was off by 170,000 out of 700,000. Now, obviously, when you're trying to verify a race that was within 0.3%, you can't be off 170,000 out of 700,000 votes that you're trying to tabulate. And so he and some others were tasked with pulling that thing apart and fixing it, and they got it down to the 350 votes that I mentioned earlier. So they corrected those errors, but there were some serious concerns that came out at different points in the audit. So as John and I started to think about how do we fix this going forward, we came up with what's become a piece of legislation in Arizona known as House Bill 2780. And it basically says that, just as John's been saying for 18 years, our elections have to be transparent, they have to be trackable, and they have to be publicly verified. So what we came up with is every election department, and in Arizona, those are the 15 counties. We don't have very many counties like you states back east. We have 15 counties in Arizona, and 60% of the state is in one of those counties, Maricopa County around Phoenix. 20% of the state is in the second largest county, Pima, around Tucson. So 80% of our electorate voters are in 2 counties. And the other 20% of our electorate is divided amongst 13 small rural counties. But we've come up with House Bill 2780, and it basically says that county election departments will publish 4 pieces of data to their voters in their county, but essentially to the entire state, because they send their data to the Secretary of State and it's published. And here's the 4 pieces of data. At least 10 days before an election, each county will produce and publish a list of the actual voters that are registered to vote in that election by name, address, and precinct number. So that anybody who wants to, you can get 5 people together on a Sunday afternoon. If you're in the Maple precinct up in Prescott, Arizona, and you've got 900 people in your precinct, you can get together and look at that list. And you can see that on at 2150 UN Drive is Ken and Jean Bennett, registered to vote in that election. Well, I know Ken and Jean, that's where they live, and there's 2 people registered there. But if there's 36 people registered at 2150 UN Drive, then we got a problem. But the first piece of data is just name, address, and precinct numbers of the people that are registered and eligible to vote in the election. Then after the election is held, within a couple days of doing the canvass with the County Board of Supervisors and adopting the final results from the county, they release 3 more pieces of information. The first one is a list of who voted in the election, again by name, address, and precinct, so that you can compare that list to the first list of who's eligible, and you can see whether or not everyone who voted in the election was on the list of who was eligible to vote in the election and registered. By the way, the list of who's registered has to include inactive voters, which is a key thing in Arizona. Almost 10% of the people on our voter registration rolls in Arizona are on an inactive list because the county sent them something and they were not at the address that they thought they were at. And so it came back and they moved them to a different address. But if that voter, even if they're on the inactive list, shows up in an election and they're still in the county, they can vote. So the list of registered voters has to be eligible or active and inactive. The list of who voted, of course, should match up. Everyone on the who voted list should be on the was eligible to vote list. And then the third piece of data would be the ballot images. Now, every time a ballot goes through an election management system, it scans and takes an image of that ballot, and then their software tabulates the votes on that ballot from that image. There should be one ballot image, no more, no less, for everyone who voted in the election. And when we can see that there is one for everyone who voted, then you begin to dispel all kinds of ideas or notions about whether there were ghost ballots that came in from Asia or, I mean, we heard all kinds, John and I heard all kinds of crazy things at the audit. People hearing about 40,000 ballots coming in from Asia at Sky Harbor Airport on election night. And there was no evidence of that, but just the mere suggestion that that may have happened turned John into Bamboo Brakey, because he had the courage to tell one of the reporters covering the audit that they're in there looking for bamboo in the paper. Now, I don't know that they really were actually doing that, but they probably were. Maybe they were. But so the third thing is the ballot images. Is there one ballot image for every voter who voted? And then the fourth piece of data is the cast vote record, which is a record of the votes cast. It's a spreadsheet. As you know, on a spreadsheet, there's rows. Each row on the cast vote record is a ballot. And the columns on that spreadsheet are the choices that a voter had on their ballot. So row number 1 is the first ballot processed in election. Biden might be in column D and Trump's in column E and Jorgensen's in column F or whatever it is. And you can look through the cast vote record and you can go to any ballot you want. You can go to ballot 1,642. And now you have an image of ballot 1,642. And then you can go to row 1,642 on the cast vote record and see that the votes on that ballot were correctly reflected in the spreadsheet that added up the votes. And then you can go to the totals at the bottom of each column and see that the county correctly reported that candidate Jones got whatever votes they got and candidate Smith got whatever they got. That's the essential aspect of this piece of legislation, House Bill 2780. It also does say to the counties that they have to keep the physical ballots stored in a manner for easy retrieval, because down the road, if we can get there, the frosting on the cake would be allowing candidate campaigns or anybody that's concerned about a tight election to ask the county to produce the actual physical paper ballot that corresponds with one of those ballot images. And if you do that 5 or 10 times and you see that at random, at your selection, then you get pretty comfortable knowing that, okay, nobody's messing with the images. Nobody's manipulating the images. We can see that there's one image for every voter. We can see that everyone that voted was eligible to vote and registered. And we can see that the tabulation spreadsheet, the cast vote record, correctly added up those votes. And I told my group that I was going to try to keep it to 13 or 15 minutes, and now I've gone 23. So I'm going to stop there I don't know. Lynn, was John maybe going to say a word, or I'll go back to you, Jason. You lead us from here, or Kelly, whichever one of you is.
I had one question from you. Okay. I know that, clarity. Did Arizona have clarity, its registration database, as updating registration database? Was that part of it? And do you have what about the consideration of the Edison file getting sent out to the press? And how do you control this information going out to the press before everything is done? Okay, before the elections are completed. Because we have that problem in North Carolina, and the states do. Because if you look at, we'll announce our president, who won the president in North Carolina, but Hawaii is still voting. When you look at this whole thing, they're building narratives based upon what it is, and you can go into the systems electronically, and this is where Benny Smith comes in. I don't know if he's on, and I don't see him on yet.
I don't see him yet.
But that's where the manipulation can be happening. But I do agree with you. If you're able to look at the cast vote records and the registration and be able to match it up, it's pretty hard to, you can validate that.
And I think our approach, Jason, is that almost like in blockchain technology or whatever, that if you have good data, and the more people that have that good data in their hands, the less chance that there is that somebody, if there's one bad actor or one bad group that wants to manipulate the data for their agenda or whatever, then if 15 other people or groups or the general public itself and the media and universities and whoever else wants to take those 4 pieces of data that I talked about, if everyone else has that data and one bad actor tries to manipulate the data for their agenda, then they've got 14 people that come down them like a ton of bricks saying, and nobody, you're going to be able to try to manipulate data one time. Mm-hmm. And when you're caught trying to manipulate data one time by the other 14 or 1,400 people or organizations that have the same data, you're done.
That makes sense.
If I could jump in, is that I was in a court case in 2007 that, believe it or not, we were the first ones in the United States and the world to get electronic databases released. And it was insanity. The trial turned into the trial of mayhem and chaos, because that's what they claimed would happen if these things were released to the wild. And, and I remember my lawyer standing up and saying, Bill Reisner, he says, Your Honor, and he's asking this guy out of Georgia named Merle King, and he says, Sir, have you ever heard of being tarred and feathered and run out of town in a rail? The county has the original ballots. The county has the original database. And if we were to take that and do something with it, we would destroy our credibility because they have the proof. Now, here we are today. The county has the original ballot. The ballot is married to the ballot image. Now they've agreed not to redact anything because you're tampering with evidence. The ballot images are hashed and protected. And so we don't want any redaction. And it is a class 1 charge if you went ahead and took those images, tried to falsify them, and bring them back. Like I said, they got the original and they got the image. We don't see a problem. And we've convinced the county not to redact anything because they would be tampering with evidence. So if somebody draws something on a ballot that shouldn't be there, we have no problem with that. In fact, in my states, if they write their name on it, we don't even want that redacted because ballot selfies are illegal in our state. You can take a picture and you can put it online. And so there really is no argument. And it comes down to one thing that we all have to remember is that the actual act of voting is the secret process. Counting is a public process. And that goes in most states except for maybe the state of Washington because their constitution says absolute secrecy. So we see something that if you work to get to your constitution and look at it, you're going to find that. And when you study the history of voting, the Australian ballot, and all these things, and these are things that, we would be glad to explain in other meetings, create films to help people understand that we have a government that is supposed to be run by we the people. and we do the hiring and the firing, and we want the right to verify elections. And the new slogan is, elections are not any good unless they're transparent, trackable, publicly verified with a ballot library. And that's the mission that we are challenging everybody we know to work with us, and that we should be able to agree on as Americans, and to make that black box transparent. Thank you.
Yeah, and we've worked extensively in dozens of meetings with the county lobbyists and officials, the Arizona Association of Counties, to give them liability protections and whatever. If somebody's written something on a ballot that's obscene or whatever, we've really worked hard to make sure that the counties, and I think they've pretty much gone neutral on the bill. Change is hard for anybody, but I think they understand that if elections are transparent, trackable, and publicly verified, then it helps take them off the hook as to allegations or insinuations that they were doing something behind the scenes.
Great.
Any other questions?
Lynn, I think you had something, right? You wanted to present?
Yeah, Benny Smith and we went to Arizona, what was that, back in October, John? And we sort of, I come at this from a process standpoint. I should probably introduce myself. Lynn Bernstein. I'm from Transparent Elections, NC. And I'm really into process. I'm a former engineer. I formerly did engineering work, and now I'm using that engineering expertise towards making our elections transparent, trackable, and publicly verified. And now with the ballot library is such a fantastic idea. And me and John and Benny and Ken, Ken met remotely, but the three of us were in Arizona, and we kind of hashed out some of those four things. And so the good news is for North Carolina, and I'm just going to share my screen here, is that North Carolina, we already have those first two. We already have, so how can we make a ballot image work in North Carolina? There are current roadblocks, but the good news is that North Carolina's voter rolls are public, and so we can see the inactive list. That's public, and we can also see who voted and by what method and in what precinct. And so the two of those are already ready for North Carolina. Now, North Carolina has a general statute that specifically states that ballots aren't a public record, and so that is going to be a hurdle that we have to overcome. Cast vote records and cast vote record databases, those are a public record. Those are not restricted, and the vendors can't say that they're proprietary because they're released in other states. And sort of the last hurdle that we have is that North Carolina doesn't have a secret ballot. By law, we have a retrievable ballot number on all absentee early and absentee by mail ballots in North Carolina. This number is printed on the outside of the return envelope along with the voter's name, and each county has a database that links that retrievable ballot number to the voter's actual ballot. That number is also written in red ink at the top of your ballot. So North Carolina, we do not have a secret ballot, and in order to make this ballot image audit work in North Carolina, we're going to have to get that number off. And so the call to action really is we want people to learn more about ballot images and cast vote records. Jason and I, his group NC-Election, and my group Transparent Elections NC, in the upcoming months, we're going to be holding informational sessions about ballot images and cast vote records, and really teach people why these are so important for our democracy to survive. Because if we don't have elections that are transparent, trackable, publicly verified with the ballot library, we aren't going to have elections that are successful. And I define an election that is successful as one where the electorate has confidence in the results, where the losers of the election believe that they lost, and they can go tell the people who supported them that, yeah, they lost because the proof is there. And so after we do that, we're going to start a campaign to write to the Legislative Oversight Committee. In North Carolina, our elections structure is set up a little bit differently than other states. Our Secretary of State does not have anything to do with our elections. And so all we have sort of as oversight for our state board is a joint non-standing legislative oversight committee. And so we need to start lobbying to them. Number one that we could start doing now is that North Carolina, we don't save our ballot images. We actually don't save them all, and the machines are already set up and designed to save ballot images. It's really as easy as clicking in the settings to save all ballot images. Right now, we only save the write-in ones, and I believe that that breaks federal law because that ballot image is what is used to actually calculate our vote. It's not the ballot that's used to calculate our vote. It's that image that's used. And so when North Carolina, when we scan those ballots, the machine creates a ballot image, and then if they don't save it, and then in the cast vote record, there's it says how the vote is allocated. Well, you've just deleted probably the most important piece of documentation in an entire chain of custody for an election. So right now, we could start pushing on the state to mandate that counties start saving those ballot images. And we're going to lobby to get the retrievable ballot number removed. And then we're going to lobby to get those ballot images public. And so, so in North Carolina, we want people to jump in and join these teams because this is really the future of elections.
Hey, Lynn, question for you.
Sure.
In my presentation, I have a tape of Wake County that shows that a blank ballot can be scanned and that only images were saved as W, only write-in.
Right,
so
that's correct.
Is that a correct setup?
So I've asked this question before. The write-ins, absolutely not. That is not the correct setup. It should. So the infrastructure is there. So this doesn't cost counties money. This isn't going to cost the state more money. In fact, it'll probably cost the state less money because they won't have to deal with lawsuits for people challenging the election. People can see if they've won or lost. So our machines are set up, and by law, the machines have to essentially give the voter a second chance to mark their ballot if they've overvoted. But it doesn't say anything about undervoting. But that's something that we could work on because. Yeah, I mean, we should be, and when we release these ballot images, we're going to see how many blank ballots there are, right? Maybe so we will see that. And if we do start seeing a lot of that, that's something that we should look into as to why that's happening or why that's showing up. Yeah, John, go ahead.
If I could jump in.
Yeah, go ahead.
I find blank ballots in there, and usually the blank ballot is somebody didn't hit the oval and they circled the circle or put a check mark next to it is what they've done. The machine only reads exactly what's in the oval is all it reads, okay? And secondly, I want you to think this way, is that if they're not saving, they're destroying public records that could be used to prove that elections are real. Now I stress, public records. We've already, through Florida, because we're suing in Florida for them destroying public records. We've sued in other states. That's how Arizona saved them. We sued them and we won, okay? And so basically, we're in a situation that we do want to file records requests and we do want to point out these people and show the federal law to them. And then we need to file a writ of mandamus against them for destroying public records and take them to court. And that's something as we're educating. And here we are. We want to work and form a nonpartisan group working together on a subject matter like this. And then we want to educate everybody to understand how elections work. I'm very glad to see Mickey Donahoe, my mentor. He used to be an NSA agent for 37 years. And he taught me that a logic and accuracy test is an important test, but it only proves it's working right at this moment. And why we couldn't. And then Volkswagen came along and made the perfect scenario. They built a computer that went into a car that passed emissions in this country maybe as much as 2 million times. But if you put it on the road and plugged it in then, you would find it was cheating by 40 to 80 times over the limit. And so basically, yeah, we want to meet with legislators. We want to educate all we can. and then get a bill like Arizona help draw. Yes, we think that secrecy is important and you shouldn't be putting a number on a ballot that can trace back to a voter. Okay, that number only belongs on it after it is anonymous and separated from the envelope, and it does not tie back to a voter. And so basically, by all of us working together and accomplishing this thing, we can all get there faster if we become nonpartisan thinkers and believe that it's either this or something really bad can happen down the line. And thank you.
Ken, you have your hand up.
Yes. In Maricopa County alone, when you talk about blank ballots, or I assume you meant kind of undervotes or no vote, in a particular race. In Maricopa County alone in the 2020 general election, there were over 33,000 no votes for president. And this is a race that was decided by just over 10,000 votes statewide. Now, when the county got it, so one of the positive things about focusing on ballot images is once the county got in and looked at those 33,000 no votes for president, they realized that some of them were overvotes. Somebody marked Biden and Trump, and you couldn't tell which one they wanted over the other. There were other situations, as John mentioned, that somebody circled an oval or put a check mark next to it, as they did all the other races down the ballot. And so when humans started to look at some of those 33,000 no votes for president, they explained them down to about 8,000. But one of the things that was used by people who thought the election was stolen in Arizona was this idea that there were all these blank ballots and they needed to be looked at. And some states like Maryland, they let the counties do their election management with whatever election management system or company that they use. And then the state contracts with a company to come in and just take the ballot images and run them through a second independent tabulation and just verify that the results that the counties did on their first tabulation were accurate. And it's just, there's different ways of doing it, but the fundamental idea of transparency, trackability, and publicly verifying elections is something that is so important. If we don't, I can remember in 2016 hearing a lot of Democrats complain about whether or not Trump really beat Clinton without Russian interference or whatever. And then 4 years later, I'm hearing my Republicans complain in the reverse. And if we lurch every 2 or 4 years from one election to another where the losers are alleging that they couldn't have lost except by fraud, we are going to lose our country. And, my first foray into politics was 1985. I was 25 years old running for the Prescott City Council. And somehow I got enough votes to be elected. But the guy that got elected with me won by 3 votes over the third place finisher who didn't get a seat because there were only 2 seats available. And when you have races that close, you got to be able to verify and show the public in a transparent way that every vote was counted correctly. And we've got to do it as Republicans, Democrats, Independents. John mentioned in one of our pre-meetings to this meeting that my 4 years as Senate President in Arizona were the 4 years that a lady named Janet Napolitano was the governor of our state. You don't get much more liberal, hardcore Democrat than Janet Napolitano. You don't get much more conservative and Republican than Ken Bennett. But if you look at the state of Arizona for the last 40 years, there are only 4 years in which the state budget, which is the most important thing that the state legislature does every year, in the last 40 years, there's only 4 years where a majority of Republicans and a majority of Democrats in each the House and the state Senate voted in support of a budget. So if Janet Napolitano and Ken Bennett can come together and pass budgets that get strong majorities of both caucuses to support those budgets, then we've got to be able to come together as Americans and improve our elections and make them secure and make people have confidence in them.
Thank you. If anybody has a comment they want to bring on or question, please raise your hand. Lynn, I think you're up.
Yeah, Ken, I just wanted to ask you, I think a lot of people, what you were saying is right, and that's exactly why I got into elections, was because after the 2016 election, there were a lot of Democrats saying that they weren't sure if Trump really won. And we talked about this last night, how, I thought, okay, well, let me see what I can do from my end, and I started looking at test reports and things like that. But the bottom line is that you're right. Now the other side is doing that. And I can see how lurching from one election to the next is, I feel like that's already kind of started. And so could you talk a little bit about the dangers of looking backward and not just coming together? Because I've gone out to the state and I've talked to a lot of Republicans, Democrats, Libertarians, people who are unaffiliated, and it seems like there's no daylight between the one issue of making elections transparent, trackable, and publicly verified, and I think should have a ballot library. What are the dangers of us looking back? I don't think it's feasible to look back, and we got to look forward, but I wanted to hear what you think.
Well, if we look backwards with an intent to argue about something in the past or decertify an election or, whatever, there's no mechanism, for example, in Arizona at all to decertify an election. And I'm again running for the state Senate, and I happen to be running against the other gentleman in my Republican primary race who says that if he's elected, he's going to sponsor and support legislation that allows the state legislature to set aside the results of an election by the people and decide by themselves who won an election and withdraw our presidential electors if necessary, and on and on and on. And yet his website says he's a constitutional conservative. What's constitutional about a state legislature, with 46 votes, 47, 31 in the House and 16 in the Senate? What is constitutional about 47 people having the power to set aside the votes of we the people and decide who they think won the election? It's ridiculous. So if we look backwards from a perspective of how we fix things going forward, that to me is about the only value of looking backwards, to make sure that, and that's what got me into politics in the first place. I was raised by parents who said, if we want to make the city of Prescott better tomorrow than we think it was yesterday, then, pretty soon mom's the PTA president and dad's the president of the Lions Club, and then he runs for the city council, and he's, on and on and on. And that's why I do what I do. And if we look backwards from a perspective of, okay, how do we not do something that was a mess and make it better going forward? So I think our focus needs to be on how do we bring transparency, trackability, and publicly verified elections to the voters so that they have confidence that the results that were given them by the county or the state or the whoever does it was right, was accurate, not right or left. This, as John always says, this is not about the left, the right and the left. This is about right and wrong. And couldn't agree more. I will never probably vote for the same person for president of the United States that John Brakey does. John Brakey is a bigger Bernie Sanders fan than Bernie Sanders.
Yeah. But I would vote for you, Ken. I have stood with other Republicans because I supported a county attorney who was a Republican. For him, it was justice over politics, and that's important to me. So I do go with individuals, and I'm out here. I've been in 18 states. I'm here I go into a state. I try to find great people like Lynn Bernstein or Jason. Very impressed with his energy and what he is about. And it's important to me that we get together and we talk about the 7 C's of what we do: character, capacity, credibility. With civility, I can call you bad names real nicely. Look at Ken, he's a perfect picture of it, of civility and how he handles. I've seen him in the battles. He had to travel the state. But anyway, after civility, there's citizenship, there's country. But the big C is to be courageous enough to stand up by yourself and form a small little group. I never ask people to join Audit USA. I want people like Lynn to form her home group, or for Jason to grow his, because I don't want to take their voice. I'm looking to build a horizontal organization, not a vertical. And I'm learning, I want to help people learn those 7 C's, because if you do really well and practice those 7 C's really well, then you wind up with 2 more C's. You create change, because the 7 help you do it. Because what kind of a character has the capacity to go out and say things and then find out it's wrong? I want to take it back to the audit. On November 30th, when the Rudy Giuliani show came into town, a friend of mine named Dr. Shiva, who I trained, me and Ben taught fraction magic, came in with a couple other people. And they claimed that every vote for Joe Biden had a 1.3 and every vote for Trump had a 0.7. Well, that was a good theory. They could have checked the images. And in fact, Dr. Shiva at the very end said, wow, this is incredible. They finally gave me all the images. He invented a machine that could count them. And he says, if you had paid me the $50,000, I could have done it for that, and you wouldn't have spent the other $9 million. And it was sad how bad this audit went, because Karen Fann, I think, is a fine person. Now, she's a Republican. She's the president of the Senate. She represents her constituents. I've always thanked her for doing what? Representing her constituents. And she had set up a system that this audit only would have cost $150,000, and it was all going to be privately fundraised. But what happened? All of a sudden, the Board of Supervisors says, yeah, we're with you. And then all of a sudden, G. Gordon Liddy's son walks in. The acorn don't fall far from the tree. And he says, you don't want to do that. And they go into a secret meeting. One guy came out and says, yeah, they were afraid they might look at their results, because on election night, the county of Maricopa, which is the fastest growing county in the United States, was going to be run by a Hispanic and a black man and a black woman. As more votes came in, they lost. I said, I never really suspected the president's race. I suspected the county races, and I'll tell you why. Legislators legislate and they allocate funds. Who do they do that to? They do it to cities and counties. And when you are a developer in a fast-growing state, or like, for example, Wake County or other fast-growing counties, you'll find that there's a lot of influence, and those races are low profile, easy money, because it's easier to really work hard to get 3 of your people into a Board of Supervisors and get those contracts the way you want them. At least that's my theory, and my 18 years of experience is that when the fox guards the chicken house, they might be able to take some eggs when they want them. And in our state, interesting enough, to get a recount in Arizona, the results have to be within 1/10 of 1%. That's crazy. That's an anomaly. But what's worse, in a county race, tell me if I'm wrong, Ken, it's 10 votes.
There's a bill in the legislature that's right now that will standardize the percentage of margin of victory so that it applies in all the races rather than these just unbelievably low margins in the county races.
We want to give time.
I know I'm not in charge, but we had talked earlier about wanting to keep this to an hour or less, and we're quickly coming up to that point. So if there's anyone else that has questions, challenges, or whatever
is there anything?
Let's see, Charles would like to speak.
Is there anything?
This is Charles from Texas. I thank John Brakey for the time he spent with me to introduce me to this program. I'm a full believer in the future of this program. My concern is with mail-in ballots. We have our elections in Texas. I'm an election judge, pretty carefully controlled for in-person voting, but I can't square that with the fact that people can take a mail-in ballot and it's not secret, it's not private. They can go to their local church and fill it out. They can go to the Lions Club and fill it out. They can share it with their family. And so we're incentivizing people to use an insecure method of voting. That's my problem with mail-in votes. And I know this program is not set up to control mail-in votes, but it's a current concern. It's a big concern that sits out there with me. Where do we go with that?
Well, Charles, we have the same problem in North Carolina with mail-in. Not the same problem, but we have the mail-in is an issue. We have to stop early voting and go to one-day election. And you can still have mail-in for people who are disabled or cannot, or in the military. But that should be it. We don't need to have 18 days of mail-in.
So Ken, Ken, you had something you wanted to say about that?
Well, I just wanted to point out, Charles, that's an excellent observation of a potential point of weakness in your elections in Texas, and that applies across the country. I wish that the audit of Maricopa County had focused more on the ballot envelope signature verification process, because at first the questioners, the skeptics of the election in Arizona or in Maricopa County were saying the machines had to have been manipulated, and if we will just hand count the paper ballots, we will come up with a different result. Well, we hand counted 2.1 million ballots, and we came up with the same result. And so then the talk started to change to, well, people that were unauthorized and not registered to vote got to vote, or people are voting twice because they're mailing in duplicate ballots, and there's anecdotal evidence that people got mailed 4 or 5 ballots at their house. Or, I walked the streets in Arizona for Donald Trump's campaign, and I would go to a house, and they gave us a little phone app called Sidekick, and I would look, as I'm walking up to the front door, I look at Sidekick, and there's a female and a male named Jones, and there's a female and a male named Smith, and there's a female and a male named Garcia. And I'd get to the front door and I'd say, I don't know whether to ask for the Joneses or the Smiths or the Garcias. And they'd say, oh, we're the Joneses, and we bought the house a couple of years ago from the Garcias, and I think the Garcias bought it 5 years ago from the Smiths. That gets reported by people, and it festers this idea that people are voting more than once, concerns like you're talking about, Charles. And so one of the purposes, whether somebody votes in person, whether they vote by mail, whether they vote however, if, as our legislation does, if you can at least begin by saying that everybody on the who voted list was on the eligible and registered to vote, and there's only one ballot image for everyone who voted, then a lot of the weaknesses in checking mail-in ballots are at least lessened in the mind of people when you can confirm that everyone who voted was registered to vote and nobody was voting more than once. And yes, there are things beyond what's in this legislation and this idea, such as maybe second or third pieces of data, last 4 digits of a social, or some people say thumbprint, or some people say, Jason, get rid of mail-in ballots altogether, get rid of drop boxes. There's things that we can talk about, but they are all part of accomplishing the 3 things that John has been talking about for almost 2 decades, and that's transparency, trackability, and publicly verified. And your concern is a good one, and it's something that we need to also continue to work on, but it's beyond what we're kind of doing right now.
Yeah, I agree with you. This is the first step, and it sets a framework within which we can go in and take care of a lot of the details to make the whole system better. Thank you.
Agreed. Now, Ken, in Surrey County, when we presented up there just last Monday, we had 170 affidavits where we saw that there were problems with the 2020 elections, and the county commissioners did not take any action on that. That's amazing.
It is. That's amazing and disappointing.
Yes.
the audit results of Arizona by the Senate were forwarded on to the Attorney General of the state of Arizona. He came out with an interim report, which he's been very heavily criticized that, Attorney General's offices don't do interim reports on investigations that they're making, but he happens to also be running for the U.S. Senate nomination on the Republican side in Arizona, and he's getting beat up on one side for doing too much and another side for not doing enough. But they claim to have found hundreds, if not thousands, of deficiencies in the transfer documents, the custody documents, chain of custody documents, when county officials go out to a drop box and pick up 100 ballots or however many was in the drop box, and they're supposed to be people from two parties, and you both sign that we picked up 102 ballots, and then you take it back to the county department, and then two different people signed there. Yes, they gave us 102. They said that there's thousands of those documents where they're missing one or more of the four signatures. There's lots of things that we've got to do to improve our elections, but we got to get started somewhere. And to me, we start with accountability, trackability, and publicly verified.
Good point. All right, we're at 1:59 right now. Does anybody have anything that they want to bring up? We got less than a minute. Lynn, do you want to have any closing statements?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Ken for being here, and this gives me hope about our future, that we can come together from all different political backgrounds, and we're going to be more powerful when we all show up together at the legislative building to say, hey, we all want this. These are our elections and we want this. So thank you, Ken, for being here, and I think this is great.
Just to add one more thing, just for people who come on that are new, that didn't hear in the beginning, there are Democrats and Republicans on this call. And going forward in North Carolina, Lynn and I and our teams and other teams, we're all going to start working together on building a solution, like you said, that is transparent, trackable, and publicly verifiable, so that we can move forward and have transparent elections. Because we have to do this, or we will not have a country. So, Lynn, I have many meetings going on across the county, all these different counties. I'd love for you to join this to give us not just a one-sided view of a Republican view, right? So that we can both work together and solve these problems. Just a thought process here. Do we want to continue these meetings going forward, like every Saturday at 1 o'clock? So that we can keep people up to date on what's going on, where we're going, and maybe we'll have a specific focus and a specific topic we're going to talk about at the next meeting.
I think that'd be great. Let's plan a time. It may be Saturdays, but I do think we should start meeting to educate people about these ballot records. So definitely reach out to me and Jason on our respective websites and get on our list, and we'll send you information about the next meetings. Okay, thank you, everyone. This has been great, and I think we're gonna end it here.
Yes, thank you, Ken. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank you all.
Well, Rick wanted to say something before we end the call. Rick?
Oh, please go ahead, Rick.
No, I just wanted to say one of the things that I want to make sure that we get on the table here is basically an action item list that we can work going forward to say who's doing what and how we're getting there, because this is all great stuff I heard on here, but if we don't have a plan on how we get there, we're not going to be successful. That's all I wanted to say.
Good point.
All right.
All right, so I think we're going to have to get back together and work those details out, Rick. And I think
I agree.
Time we'll do it. Any other questions before we close? All right, guys, have a great weekend, and we'll talk to everybody soon.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.